Hello and welcome to UKEdChat After Hours. I'm Martin. If you want to find out more about me, you can go to my Twitter handle, which is ICTMagic on Twitter. If you want to know more about UKEdChat, who is hosting this event, then you can go to UKEdChat.com or you can find us on Twitter. Now, this is an interactive session, so if you want to ask any questions about anything that we're discussing and talk to my guest, then please do so. There are lots of different ways you can do that. You can use the UKEdChat hashtag on Twitter. You can also use the chat function in YouTube if you're watching there. And if you're watching a recording of this, then again, if you use any of those methods or wherever you see this, then we should be able to get those questions to my guest. So, my guest, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Megan Sweet. I am the founder of Your Three Eyes, which is an education consulting firm here in California in the United States. And I focus on supporting educators to develop a nurturing relationship with themselves and prioritizing themselves at the same time that they work in their schools. So you can find me at Your Three Eyes website, Twitter, Instagram, all those things.
Okay, super. Now, just to let you know that we've just had a chat, which is all about schools returning after a long period of COVID. So if you're watching this in a couple of years' time, then there was once a thing called COVID and a pandemic. How was that for you? But at the moment, we're still in the midst of it. So to give some context to my guests and also international viewers, the UK has returned to full schooling pretty much probably about 6 weeks ago now. So we've just had our Easter break, the spring break here. And the schools have been actually open throughout. And many people in the general population forget this. They've been open to what we consider vulnerable pupils and also those who are children of key workers. And that's true for primary school and secondary school, or elementary school and high school for international listeners. So obviously the picture is very different around the world, and we're very interested to hear what's happening around the world. So please do tell us that wherever you're watching this. But we really want to know about a couple of things. So first of all, what's going on in the States? Obviously, there's a patchwork system over there, so it'd be very interesting to hear what's going on nationally, if that's at all possible, but also maybe on the state and county level, perhaps where you are. And then we're going to go into a broader discussion about what we can do to maybe mitigate some of the effects of the isolation and possible anxiety and stress which has built up over the last couple of months and year of the pandemic. So could you perhaps just start with what's happening, as best you can, nationally in the States, and then perhaps go a little bit more into the granular where you are specifically?
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. So for folks who maybe don't understand how the United States makes decisions, it's a mixture of federal or national rules and regulations, and then individual states also get to make their own choices. So, for example, nationally, there have been guidelines or recommendations around sheltering in place, isolation, use of masks, things like that. But those are almost more like recommendations. They're not requirements. The requirements are actually made on a state-by-state basis. So I live in California. We've had some of the most stringent requirements and responses to COVID. Other states have had much more lenient ones. So it's all kind of dependent upon each individual state's interpretation of the federal recommendations about how we do that. So you can imagine that makes it really challenging and unusual state by state. We're all still able to move in between our individual states, but depending on the other states and how seriously they are taking or responding to COVID, sometimes we're not traveling. A lot of people aren't going anywhere at all. And there's lots of...
Hello. Right, we just had a few technical difficulties, but I think we're back now. So just to recap, that I'm in discussion with Megan Sweet, and you can find details wherever you're watching this video. But we're just in discussion about the international picture when it comes to how schooling is going back after a long period away from with the pandemic. So I've just recapped a little bit about what's going on, and Megan has just given us a little bit of a lesson about what's going on in the States. Can I ask you, obviously you're talking about the different patchwork which is going on throughout the country. What about the feeling of teachers? Is that much more unified, would you say? Or would you say that that is also quite diverse, perhaps geographically, or perhaps, obviously we understand that there's quite a bit of political divide in the States, as there is everywhere, of course, but would you say that there is an element of that in the teaching profession as well in the States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think teachers probably have a lot of the same feelings as everyone does around wanting to be with their kids in person, and that's the preference. But I do think it's been regional. So to the extent to which the state, each individual state has taken seriously or the number of case counts that there have been in different areas, I think teacher feelings have mirrored that in some ways. In California, for example, we really couldn't reopen schools, or at least there was a lot of effort to not reopen schools until teachers had been vaccinated first. But in other parts of the country, that wasn't the case because the vaccines weren't available when the teachers were starting back with their classrooms again. So it has been pretty variable. Again, I think dependent on case count and concerns. California's a big state. We've had some of the highest numbers over time in terms of COVID cases. So ours is very, like, our reopening and our teachers' reactions have been very, very tied to state and local recommendations, but it hasn't been, I would say, I think uniformly all teachers want to get back with their kids. Uniformly, teachers are prefer that, but willingness has been much more state by state.
Okay, let's maybe go into some of the mitigation of what can be done to hopefully help students and teachers, for that matter, with possible issues which have arisen because of the isolation and stress caused by the pandemic. So what would you say are some of the best strategies which teachers can deploy while they are still remotely teaching away from their pupils and students? What kind of activities, what kind of measures can teachers deploy to perhaps help their students before they come back to the classroom and teach face-to-face?
Yeah, I think, and I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in the United States, attending to social emotional well-being of students has always been treated a little bit like it's important, but not as important as instruction. And so it's always a little bit taken, not a back seat, but like a side seat to the instructional practices. I think what's happened this year is that people are seeing that we need to prioritize social emotional well-being even before instruction. And so things teachers can do, whether they're in person with their kids or they're still home and they're teaching their kids remotely, is really building in those places for connection. Allowing kids to connect with one another so that they can talk to their peers, just appreciating the isolation that all of our kids have been in. And even if they're back in person, getting used to being back in person with their peers when they haven't been for so long. Finding ways for kids to give a pulse check on how they're feeling. So really quick, easy engagement strategies you can use is to let kids tell how they're feeling. Like, what's your weather pattern today? Is it cloudy or is it sunny? Little ways for the teachers to be able to check in on how their students are feeling is really important. And looking for some of those cues. How are kids communicating? Have their communication norms changed? Is a normally active kid suddenly very quiet? Things like that. Just noticing how kids are expressing themselves, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think that's the notion of noticing is really quite important. And there are many students who simply disappear in the background for whatever reason, and it's really important to notice those as well. During our Twitter chats, you introduced the idea of learning loss, and you actually asked the community what it means. Could I ask you, what does it mean to you?
Well, that's a great question. It's been a really big topic here, anyway, in the United States. This fear of learning loss and of kids being able to maintain the pace of learning that you would normally have in a traditional school year, where you have your teacher. So we set all of our instruction around standards, and so this idea that maybe kids aren't going to be able to meet the standards that they would have before, and what does that look like? And it becomes this thing of a lot of anxiety for us out here around wanting to make sure that kids are staying on track. And then what are the long-term implications if kids didn't learn all they were supposed to do, say, in grade 5? What does that mean when they get to grade 6? Things like that. So how do we make sure we address that? Interestingly, for the most part, kids haven't had the kind of learning loss in terms of academic skills as you might expect. And a lot of kids are staying pretty much on track. But I think there is this depth of knowledge that might be missing when you don't have the kinds of conversations or lived experiences in the classroom that you really can't reproduce online. My son, for example, I think he's been staying up with his science work, but even just this week, his first week back this week in school, he came home and he was like, I love science. And I was like, oh, well, what made it different? And he was able to look in a microscope, and he was able to talk with his peers about something that he saw in a microscope, and then connect that to the lesson in a way that he couldn't do just remotely. So those little experiences are ones that I think are shaping the depth of the learning, but maybe the explicit skills maybe kids are going to get, but they won't have it as hardwired as they would if they were in person, I think.
Oh, fascinating. And it's amazing what we can do remotely, but it's amazing what we must be in person to do as well. So as you say, just looking down a microscope is such a little thing,
right?
But it makes such a difference. So your son is now a week back at school. So can I ask you, maybe what do you hope that teachers are doing, thinking, putting in place a week into schools being back from a well-being point of view? What do you think that schools should be putting in place that early into the new school, I suppose the new school year in many ways?
Yeah. I think it is building those connections. It's helping to reestablish the social bonds that have been on pause or broken or never developed for students. It's, I don't know what the expectations are in the UK, but for my son, for example, he hasn't been required to have his camera on all year. And so he hasn't. So, and a lot of his peers haven't. So he actually hasn't even seen some of his classmates for most of the year. He hasn't had a chance to speak to them. So redeveloping those social bonds, ways to talk with one another, ways to connect, reconnect with peers. He's been spending a lot of time with his parents, but not as much with friends or classmates that would help him to feel more learning. Helping kids to name or address what's been going on for them over the last year. So I would say more important than the instructional stuff, although instruction is important, really be able to re-socialize, get kids back on track with what it is, and to start recovering from this year that has been so extreme is the most important thing that we can do right now. I'll also say in California, we're only open a very fraction of the time. So my kid goes to school a little over an hour a day in person. The rest of the time is still online. So again, depending on where you're at in the country, some schools are fully reopened. But here it's just an hour. So I would say that hour is best spent on building those social connections and helping kids to reconnect with what it is to be a student in person.